I bought this cabin for peace and nature, but the HOA had other plans. One morning, without warning, chainsaws. They cut down my trees on my land claiming beautification. No permits, no rights, just arrogance. I sued them. They laughed, but nature didn't. Heavy rains hit, and suddenly, the slope collapsed, flooding their clubhouse and homes. Then FEMA stepped in and redrew the flood zone. Now their homes are uninsurable. Their clubhouse condemned my land, high, dry, and untouched. HOA cut my trees, and Mother Nature cut them down. It began like any other morning, at my peaceful lakeside cabana, misty sunrise over the still water, the birds chirping in the canopy above, and the comforting creak of the dock as I stepped out with my coffee butt. The tranquility shattered the moment I heard the first crack of a chainsaw tearing through the air, followed by the unmistakable crash of a falling tree. I ran through the back door, heart pounding, and what I saw made me stumble. A crew of men in fluorescent vests and hardhats were cutting down my trespassed, my trees without permission, tearing through a stand of mature pines and cedars that had stood for decades, their roots anchoring the hillside and their shade guarding the forest floor. And in the middle of it all stood a woman I recognized well, Leila Brenner, the newly elected president of the recently expanded HOA that had annexed the neighborhood beyond the lake and, apparently, believed their influence extended across property lines and legal boundaries. I shouted over the machines, demanding answers, but she calmly handed me a folded letter on official-looking HOA letterhead citing emergency fire hazard mitigation per some internal safety resolution, even though it had no legal bearing over my land, which had been explicitly written out of the HOA covenant when I bought it 10 years ago. I tried to call the sheriff, but by the time a deputy arrived, half a dozen trees were already down, their massive trunks laid out like fallen soldiers, their splintered stumps leaking sap into the dirt. And, to my astonishment, the deputy seemed hesitant to act, mumbling something about it being a civil matter and suggesting I take it up with the county. I couldn't believe it. Those trees weren't just part of the view, they were the buffer that held back soil erosion, protected the cabin from lake spray during storms, and created a natural windbreak that made winters bearable and summers cool. And now they were gone, just like that, all because the HOA wanted a clearer shoreline view for their members. I called my lawyer immediately and began documenting everything: photos, videos, flagged stumps, even drone footage from a friend who flew over the site. The HOA sent me a notice claiming they had the right to beautify the shared landscape and mitigate fire risk across adjacent parcels, citing vague municipal codes that didn't even apply to forested private property outside their jurisdiction. Furious, I filed a lawsuit for trespassing, unlawful tree removal, and property damage, backed by an environmental consultant who estimated the trees' collective value at over $150,000, not to mention the ecological damage caused by removing them without replanting. Lila dismissed the suit publicly, calling it a homeowner's tantrum, and the local news even picked it up, painting me as the stubborn recluse, resisting progress. But then the weather turned. Within a month, we were hit with a series of intense storms, unusual for the time of year, dumping inches of rain across the lake basin. And with the trees gone, the slope behind the clubhouse, which sat just downhill from my cabin, began to slide. Water pooled, soil shifted, and the once picturesque walking trail the HOA had built right along the shoreline began to crack and sink. The newly exposed edge of the clubhouse lot turned into a muddy mess. And then the real damage came. Basements of nearby homes started flooding during even light rains. Runoff carved new channels down the hill, and the HOA began quietly placing sandbags and hastily installed drainage pipes along the perimeter. Still, they had the audacity to send me a letter blaming the flooding on excessive cabin runoff, and demanding that I pay for erosion control barriers. That was the last straw. I went to the county environmental office and laid out everything: the illegal logging, the boundary overreach, the consequences already unfolding. To my surprise, they were alarmed, especially since the HOA hadn't filed any soil impact reports or obtained permits for shoreline alteration. Then came the call that changed everything. The county had flagged the HOA's lakeside development zone for a FEMA reassessment due to the environmental changes and structural instability, meaning flood zone lines might be redrawn based on the current topography, and if that happened, insurance rates would skyrocket, and some homes might become uninsurable. I didn't gloat, not yet, but I felt the wind shift in my favor. I continued rebuilding my part of the land, planting new trees where I could, installing erosion netting, and keeping everything documented for the upcoming court date, while the HOA doubled down on public statements denying wrongdoing, calling the floods seasonal anomalies, and assuring their residents everything was under control. But it wasn't. By the time FEMA surveyors arrived with their measuring tools and mapping drones, the damage was impossible to ignore. Sinkholes along the trail, standing water near the clubhouse foundation, and slope instability that one inspector called a slow-motion disaster. As I watched from my porch, sipping coffee once again, the same birds chirping overhead, I saw Lila pacing near the clubhouse in a suit and high heels. desperately trying to persuade the assessors to ignore the altered terrain her own HOA had mutilated in pursuit of an unobstructed lake view. The irony was rich. They had chopped down nature's safeguards, and now nature was reclaiming the land. As FEMA staked orange flags along the lower basin, one surveyor nodded toward my cabin and said, "You're lucky. Your elevation's clean. Your trees did their job." I nodded. Not just lucky, pet. Leela and her board had taken something irreplaceable from me, but in doing so, they triggered a reckoning far greater than any lawsuit I could have mounted. One rooted in federal law, rising water, and a truth you can't chainsaw away. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to look the slope failures. The pooling water, the slow erosion of carefully manicured trails now turned into muddy ravines, but the HOA, in its usual fashion, continued to double down on arrogance. Instead of owning their mistake, even as FEMA agents walked their properties with clipboards and mapping tools, placing bright orange stakes and fluorescent survey flags around the clubhouse, the lakeside park, and the row of luxury homes closest to the water that once boasted unbeatable views on real estate listings, I watched the whole show from my cabin's wraparound porch. The very trees that had survived their chainsaw assault now standing taller than ever, in contrast to the destruction below. And I couldn't help but marvel at how karma often shows up in a reflective vest and government-issued boots. The final FEMA report came in 3 weeks after their initial assessment and changed everything, due to the HOA's unpermitted alteration of the shoreline, loss of natural vegetation, and lack of sufficient water management infrastructure. The entire southern lakeside stretch, including the clubhouse, walking trail, and 27 homes, was officially reclassified as a special flood hazard area, or, in plain terms, a high-risk flood zone. What that meant was a nightmare for the HOA. Every homeowner now had to purchase expensive federal flood insurance. New construction and renovations required federal approval. Property values dropped overnight, and most damning of all, the clubhouse, their pride and joy, was deemed critically vulnerable and labeled ineligible for public or private insurance until it underwent major, likely multi-million-dollar elevation and reinforcement projects. Panic set in like a virus at the next HOA meeting, which I attended not as a member, but as a guest, invited by a growing group of angry residents who had finally seen past the board smoke and mirrors and were desperate to know how their property values had tanked and who exactly was responsible. Lila Brenner, still clinging to the podium like a sinking ship's wheel, tried to spin the FEMA classification as temporary and negotiable, blaming weather anomalies and even attempting to shift fault to my cabin by alleging I had diverted runoff water toward their side, an accusation so desperate and ludicrous that even the county hydrologist present at the meeting laughed out loud before explaining, in plain terms, that the destruction was the result of removing large, established trees that had long served as natural flood mitigation. The room turned cold. Homeowners began yelling, waving letters from their insurers and realtors, demanding resignations, demanding compensation, demanding answers, and Leela, backed into a corner, could no longer hide behind polished language and HOA platitudes. It was chaos, and yet I remained calm, seated in the back, arms crossed, holding a file of documents that would soon deliver the final blow. You see, while FEMA was doing their work, I had reopened my lawsuit with new evidence: county soil assessments, the FEMA report, insurance rejections, and satellite comparisons of my land versus the HOA's site, all of which painted a clear picture of negligence and trespass resulting in measurable financial and environmental damage. This time, the court listened. The HOA was no longer seen as a civic organization managing a community. It was an entity that had acted far outside its jurisdiction and cost dozens of people their financial security, their home equity, and their peace of mind. The court ordered an independent arbitrator to assess damages and recommended that homeowners affected could join a class action lawsuit against the board. Several did. Lila resigned less than a month later, citing personal stress, though rumor had it she was being sued personally by a group of 5 families who had purchased lakefront homes specifically for their insurance affordability and were now facing thousands per year in additional costs. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, I used part of the settlement money to restore the tree line with native evergreens and invest in a raised deck that overlooked the lake, a place to sit and read, sip morning coffee, and watch the water rise and fall, as it always had, in perfect balance, when left undisturbed. The story didn't end there, though. The State Environmental Board launched its own investigation after being alerted to unpermitted shoreline destruction, and the HOA was hit with additional fines and restoration orders. They were told they had to plant over 300 trees and shrubs within a year or face escalating penalties. But with their budget drained by legal fees, engineering consultations, and a collapsing insurance portfolio, they could barely afford maintenance on their own streetlights. The once gawky board of enforcers who sent me nasty letters and smug citations now spent meetings arguing about bankruptcy proceedings and deferred dues payments, their empire crumbling from within. And me, I was left alone. Finally, no more threats, no more notices, no more arrogant visitors with clipboards and demands. My land stood solid, rooted deep, both physically and legally. A FEMA agent even stopped by one day, long after everything had settled, and told me my approach to preservation likely saved my side of the hill from the fate that befell theirs. I nodded, smiled, and simply said, trees know more about water than most people ever will. In the end, the HOA learned that you can't manage nature like a golf course, and that when you try to strip the land of its voice, it will scream back in floods and lawsuits. Their mistake was thinking that order and power could override the wisdom of roots that had held firm for centuries. But nature never forgets. And now, neither will they.